My wife Brenda humiliated me in front of guests, saying my big dream was to be a housewife. Then she admitted to cheating on me and kicked me out of the house that I paid for over 40 years. She didn't know I had documented everything, and that the church priest was recording our last conversation. Before I tell you how she lost everything, hit subscribe, because this twist is going to take your breath away. My name is Samuel. I'm 60 years old. And for 40 years, I was the invisible provider of my family. I'd wake up at 5 a.m. I worked in management and logistics. I paid for every tile in that kitchen where Brenda humiliated me. When I retired, I thought I'd finally have time to take care of them. I learned to make artisan bread. I'd wake up before dawn to make the perfect breakfast, but they didn't see me. They just ate the bread I made and ignored me while staring at their phones. Until that Saturday dinner when everything changed. Retirement didn't silence the alarm clock that rang at 5 a.m. for 40 years. The habit was carved into my bones. While the house was still deep in silence and darkness, I got up. Before this was my time to prepare for a long day of management and logistics, to make sure the bread, in a way, came to our table. Now, with time to spare, I spent it putting real bread on the table. The kitchen, before dawn, was the only room in the house where I didn't feel like an intruder. My hands knew the way without me having to think. The cold flour, the hollow sound of tapping on the wooden bowl, the pinch of salt, the sweet smell of yeast waking up in warm water. It was a ritual, a silent prayer. Kneading the dough was like talking to my own thoughts. I put into it the hope for a good day, gratitude for still having strength in my hands. While the dough rested and rose under a damp cloth, I ground the coffee beans, the smell mixing with the baking bread, filling the house with the unmistakable scent of home. The table I sat was an offering of peace, an invitation. The golden, warm bread sliced and steaming. Butter, jam, perfectly scrambled eggs. One by one, they came downstairs. Brenda, my wife, and our kids, already in their 20s but still under my roof. They sat down, and the silence was filled not with conversations, but with the blue glow of phone screens. They grabbed the bread I made, spread butter on it, ate it. But they didn't see me. I was just the silent employee who refilled coffee cups, the ghost who prepared the feast. It was Brenda who broke the silence, but not the way I expected. "Samuel, honestly," she said, without looking up from her phone, "what's this mess in my kitchen every morning? Flour everywhere, the word my hung in the air, sharp as a knife. Now that you're retired, couldn't you get a real hobby? Why don't you go play golf like other men?" Other men, the words echoed in my head. For 40 years, I was the man of this house. The man whose sweat paid for every tile in that kitchen, for every device they used to connect with the world while ignoring me. I thought retirement meant I'd finally have time to take care of them closely, to give them the best of me in a way my job never allowed, but I was wrong. They didn't want my care. They wanted the comfort my old salary provided, and now that this role was over, my presence was just an inconvenience. I didn't answer. I just collected the empty plates, the crumbs of the bread I baked with such care left behind. As the hot water ran over the dishes in the sink, I looked out the window at the yard I had gardened myself. I was no longer the head of this family. I was an old, dusty piece of furniture whose usefulness had expired. The front door was still physically open to me, but I could feel, for the first time, the cold wind of a lock beginning to turn. The Saturday dinner was a tradition, but one that belonged more to Brenda than to me. They were her friends, from the club, from her social circle. I was the silent co-host, the man who made sure the glasses were full and the roast was perfect. That night I had outdone myself. A pork leg slowly roasted for 8 hours, with crispy, crackling skin, served with potatoes roasted in rosemary from our garden. The smell filling the house was my contribution to the conversation, my way of saying, "Welcome." We were all at the table, the wine flowing, the laughter loud. Brenda, as always, was the center of attention, a natural storyteller. And then she turned to me. "And Samuel here," she said, with a wide smile to the guests, "now that he's retired, decided that his big dream in life is to become the best housewife in the neighborhood. Isn't that right, honey?" She winked at me as if it were an intimate and affectionate joke, but the contempt in her eyes was unmistakable. A polite but uncomfortable laugh ran through the table. I felt blood rush to my face, a heat that didn't come from the wine. I froze, fork halfway to my mouth. 40 years of hard work, sleepless nights, silent sacrifices to build that life, and it was all reduced to a humiliating joke. I was a housewife, a hobby, a man without ambition. I forced a smile, but I felt something break inside me, a low, final crack like a bone snapping. The rest of the dinner went by in a blur. I got up, collected the plates, served dessert, acting on autopilot. The guests left with hugs and compliments about the food, unaware of the devastation they had just witnessed. When the door closed on the last couple, the silence that remained in the house was heavy, accusing. Brenda began collecting the wine glasses, acting as if nothing had happened. "Why did you do that, Brenda?" I asked, my voice low but firm. She turned, surprise on her face quickly replaced by defensive coldness. "Do what? It was a joke, Samuel." "You need to learn to relax, to not take everything so seriously." "It wasn't a joke," I replied. "It was cruel." And that's when the dam broke. Her frustration, held back for years, came out, not in a scream, but in icy poison. "Cruel? You want to know what's cruel? It's spending your life with a predictable man, a good man, but boring. I deserve more. I deserve ambition. I deserve passion." She took a deep breath, her eyes shining with terrible conviction. "I'm seeing someone else, Samuel. A man who has the ambition you never had." The words hit me, but the pain from the earlier humiliation was so great that the confession of betrayal seemed like just a detail. She walked toward me, her face hard, without a tear, without a drop of regret. "I want you to leave," she said, each word a shovel of dirt thrown on my coffin. "I want you to leave? This house is no longer your place." The car keys in my hand felt strangely heavy. I put on the coat that was hanging near the door, the same one I'd worn for 20 winters, and went out into the cold Virginia night. The front door closed behind me with a final click, a sound that sealed the end of my life as I knew it. There were no suitcases, no goodbyes, just the order of expulsion and my silent obedience. I was a king exiled from his own kingdom. I drove without direction, the lights of the suburbs turning into the darkness of rural roads. I ended up at a cheap motel, a place that smelled of disinfectant and loneliness. The neon vacancy sign buzzed outside my window, a flickering, sickly light. That first night I didn't cry. I sat on the edge of the hard bed looking at the stained wallpaper, and felt an emptiness so deep it felt like my body had been hollowed out from the inside. I wasn't just a man without a home. I was a man without purpose, without identity. The following days blurred into a gray haze of motel rooms and roadside cafes. I felt completely adrift. The family I served didn't want me. The career that defined me was over. And the faith that sustained me all my life seemed like a cruel joke. I felt abandoned, not just by Brenda, but by God. What kind of divine plan ended with a 60-year-old man, alone in a motel, with a heart broken into 1,000 pieces? Anger began to bubble under the surface of my pain, a silent anger against the unfairness of it all. On a particularly dark afternoon, while driving without a destination through a small town in the foothills of the mountains, I saw an old stone church, simple and beautiful. On an impulse I didn't understand, I parked the car and went in. The air inside was cold and smelled of old wood and candle wax. It was completely empty. I sat in the last pew, the silence of the place echoing the silence inside me. I didn't pray. The words seemed useless, false. I just sat there, stripped of all pride, all identity. I wasn't a retired manager, I wasn't a husband, I wasn't a father. I was just a broken man, sitting in a house that wasn't his, waiting for a sign I didn't believe would come. I let the weight of my pain fill the space, a wordless confession. After what seemed like forever, I got up to leave. On the way to the door, I passed by a side entrance that led to the community hall. The door was slightly open and the afternoon sunlight lit up the back kitchen, and that's when I saw it. Against the back wall, covered by a dusty tarp, was an old brick bread oven, the industrial kind, big enough to feed an army. It was abandoned, forgotten, and in that moment something inside me moved. It wasn't a divine voice, it wasn't a vision, it was recognition. A piece of me, which I thought was dead and buried, saw a reflection of itself in that old, dusty oven, silently waiting for a purpose. Finding the church's pastor, a man named John, was easier than I expected. He had kind eyes and a firm handshake. I sat in his modest office, the smell of old books in the air, and told him not the story of my betrayal, but the story of my craft. I talked about my love for baking, about my grandmother's recipes, about the abandoned oven I saw in the community kitchen. My voice, rusty from lack of use, found new strength when talking about the only thing I had left. I made him the most honest proposal I'd ever made in my life. "Let me fix your oven," I said. "Let me use it to bake bread for the community. In return, all I ask is a place to sleep. The small room in the back of the church. I don't need much." Pastor John listened to me in silence, his gaze never leaving mine. He saw the truth of my situation, the dignity behind my desperation. "Samuel," he finally said with a small smile, "I think that oven was waiting for you. The room is yours." That afternoon I closed my motel room door for the last time and moved into the small room behind the church hall. It was little more than a closet with a single bed and a high window, but to me it felt like a palace. For the first time in weeks, I had a place to call my own. And more important, I had a purpose. My first task was the oven. I pulled off the dusty tarp, revealing the brick and cast iron structure. It was neglected, yes, but its bones were good. The following days were filled with restoration work. I became an archaeologist, digging through layers of dust and abandonment. I cleaned out old ashes, scrubbed stained bricks, tightened rusty screws. The work was physical, demanding. Every muscle in my body ached at night, but it was good pain, clean pain. It was the pain of building, not destroying. While my hands worked on the outside of the oven, something inside me was also being fixed, piece by piece. The real test came when I lit the first fire. I stacked the dry wood, exactly as my grandfather taught me, and used a single match. The flames licked the wood, hesitant at first, then growing with a hungry roar, filling the brick chamber with a dancing orange glow. I stood there looking at the fire and felt a deep, almost primal connection. I was making a pact. I would give the oven my skill, my sweat, my time. In return, it would give me its heat, its ability to transform raw matter into something that nourishes, something that sustains life. That first night, with the oven finally heated, I made my first batch. I used my grandmother's simplest recipe: flour, water, salt, and yeast. I kneaded the dough on the church kitchen floor, under the light of a single lamp. It wasn't for sale, it wasn't to impress anyone, it was an offering, a prayer of gratitude. When I took the first bread from the oven, the crust perfectly golden, the hollow sound when tapping the bottom, I knew. I wasn't just baking bread. I was forging my new life in the fire of my own trial. The first batch was followed by the second, and then the third. I established a routine that became the new structure of my life. I'd wake up at 2 a.m, in the absolute silence of the sleeping church. I'd feed the oven, letting the heat grow slowly. And then I'd start working with the dough, a sacred ritual in the dim light. The smell of baking bread, which began to leak through the church's old chimney around 4 a.m, became the town's new alarm clock. At first, people came out of curiosity. The local sheriff on his night patrol was the first. He came into the kitchen following the smell and found me taking the golden loaves from the oven. I didn't say much. I just offered him a thick slice, still warm, with a little butter. He ate in silence, eyes closed for a moment, and when he finished, he just nodded and said, "See you tomorrow, Sam," and he came back every morning. The news spread the only way it happens in small towns, by word of mouth. Soon others began to show up. The night shift nurses from the small hospital, their faces marked with tiredness, stopped on their way home. Truck drivers, starting their long trips, were drawn by the lonely light in the church kitchen. They came in shyly, expecting to find a bread sale, but what they found was just me, a quiet man, and a basket full of warm loaves. I never set a price. Next to the basket, I placed a simple glass jar with a handwritten note. For the church, if you can. Some people left $1, others left 5. Some left nothing, and I gave them the bread with the same silent smile. The bread wasn't a business transaction, it was communion. It was my way of serving, of giving back to the sanctuary I'd been given. I became a figure in town, the church baker. People didn't know my story. Didn't know about the house I lost or the family that kicked me out, and I liked it that way. They knew me by my hands, by the bread I made. I was invited to dinners not as Brenda's husband, but as Samuel the baker. The widows of the congregation began bringing me jars of homemade jam to go with my bread. I, who felt like the loneliest man in the world, was slowly being woven into the tapestry of that community. One day, Pastor John came into the kitchen while I was arranging the loaves for the day. "You know, Samuel," he said, looking at the full basket, "when you came here you were broken. But you didn't just fix yourself. You're feeding this town, and I'm not just talking about bread." I looked at the golden loaves, steam rising in spirals in the cold morning air. I, who was kicked out and considered useless, had somehow become the nourishing heart of that small town. And that was a blessing I could never have predicted. The final scene unfolds a year later, mirroring the moment when this new life began. It's 3 in the morning, and I'm in the church kitchen, my sanctuary. The fire in the oven crackles, a constant companion in the early morning quiet. My hands, now permanently marked with small burns and dusted with flour, move with a certainty that comes not from habit but from devotion. I take a perfect batch of golden loaves from the oven, the smell filling the air with the promise of a new day. The door opens and Pastor John comes in, as he does every morning, not as a supervisor, but as the first pilgrim of the day. He hands me a mug of hot coffee, and I accept it with a grateful nod. We sit on 2 wooden benches in comfortable silence, watching the steam rise from the freshly baked bread. I'm not rich. I didn't get my old house back. The wounds of my family's betrayal will probably never completely heal, but the sharp pain has given way to quiet acceptance. My life is simpler now, reduced to the essential, the work of my hands, the gratitude of my community, and the peace I find in the darkness before dawn. The door of my old house was closed to me, it's true, but God, in His mysterious wisdom, opened the door of the oven, and with it opened the door to a purpose I never knew I was looking for. I didn't need a big house to have a home. I just needed a place, however small, where the bread I offered was received with an open heart. And here, in the warmth of this fire, I found it.